Welcome to Early Christian Views of Jesus. The letter of Barnabas, dated between 70 and 132 CE, basically between the time that the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD CE and the Bar Kokhba rebellion, starting in 132 AD CE. The reason for this is because of a reference in the letter that clearly indicates the temple has been destroyed, but that it would be rebuilt. And so it's usually seen as, of course, for that reason, after 70 AD, but before the period of the Bar Kokhba rebellion from 132 to 136 AD CE, because it's unlikely there would have been any potential for rebuilding the temple after that. So that puts it pretty early in relation to the New Testament period. In fact, if the letter is written as it's described or called, right, the letter of Barnabas, if the Barnabas that is supposedly the one who wrote the letter is the apostle from the New Testament, and even though Barnabas wasn't one of the original 12 apostles, he is named as an apostle in Acts 14:14. So if it's that Barnabas, right, whom Paul refers to several times, who's referred to throughout the book of Acts, right, in the famous account where he and Paul got into an argument because of John, also called Mark, and how Paul didn't want to take him because he wasn't working with them in the other places. And then, of course, we have in Galatians, Paul writing about how he had to confront Cephas or Peter because of partiality being shown to the Jews over the Gentiles. Really kind of like racism, basically, right? And so Paul confronted him. It wasn't just racism, it was more the whole Judaizing aspects of the law and Jewish heritage that seemed to be causing people like Peter and Barnabas, Paul says in Galatians, to follow along in this error of making separations based on, your race and your heritage to the Jews versus the Gentiles now being adopted. There being some kind of hesitancy to fully accept them, you could say, at least the way Peter was acting. And then, of course, again, the returning to the law. Now, what's interesting is when you read the letter of Barnabas, as we're going to read selections of it, we're not going to read the whole thing. But there's a section where now it's missing from the Latin version of about the 4th century. That we have an old Latin version that contains the first 17 chapters, and then that was pretty much our main authority for the letter of Barnabas until the 19th century, till the 1800s when Tischendorf found Codex Sinaiticus. And so in Codex Sinaiticus of the 4th century, right, 300s, the Epistle of Barnabas is right there, along with all the New Testament letters and other biblical documents. There's no indication that it's to be viewed any differently. And so it's for that reason, the Latin version is also of the 4th century, right? Same date, same century basically as Codex Sinaiticus, right? The 300s. So a couple hundred years from the New Testament era. That's a pretty good authority. It's similar with Codex Vaticanus, although Codex Vaticanus is considered a better manuscript overall. Either way, Codex Sinaiticus has the Epistle of Barnabas in it. Now, it's considered to be corrupt in several places, but, you'd have to read it. It's difficult to make those kinds of judgments with finality unless there's clear textual indication of a change or a corruption. Just because you may not like the content in some cases. Codex Sinaiticus sometimes has some issues, of course, with its professional quality. But either way, being in the Greek and Latin authorities of the 4th century gives the Epistle of Barnabas some decent weight. And the fact that it's referred to by early church writers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who basically accept the Apostolic Association. And then, of course, Eusebius. Now, it wasn't accepted as canonical, but again, we don't really follow. We're not just following what Eusebius or what the early church fathers or really anybody outside of the Bible, the biblical documents themselves say, oh yeah, this is definitely accepted biblical inspired authority. Well, how do you know that? Okay, some texts we have a pretty good idea that they are based on who wrote them and their historicity and things that they have said and associations with people like Jesus. But we don't really have to know for sure. All we have to know is whether or not the information is accurate, right? That's truth. What does Jesus say God's word is? Truth, right? John 17:17. Your word is truth. So, we go based on what is true. And we can't put all the things that are true in one book, right? Even Jesus, or I should say John, right? I believe it's in John 21 where he talks about how there are many other things Jesus did, and you can't put them all down in writing. There'd not be enough books to hold everything. So just because we don't have every single thing written down for us in a collectible form or readable form or book form, doesn't mean there isn't information that's also true outside of it. But it's the best collection of information related to a particular subject, in this case, the God Jah, the biblical God Jah, Jahuah, Yah-O. If you go based on the best phonetic historical evidence for the Tetragrammaton, the Trigrammaton, and then, of course, Jah, Yah, for the Bigrammaton, right? 2-letter form. So, when we come to these different sources, like the Epistle of Barnabas, we have decent authority. We don't have the best authority. There are reasons why it wasn't accepted as canonical, right? Not only because we don't have the best historical authorities, although we have some good ones. There's just not wide acceptance among the earliest Christian leaders as to whether it's genuine. There are some parts of it that are questionable, right? Either the Greek or the Latin is spurious or questionable for the final several chapters, right? Because they're not in the Latin version. So either they're missing from the Latin version or they were added to the Greek version. But they're both from the 4th century, right? So there's some questions that legitimately call into question whether or not it should be accepted among the other texts that have much better manuscript and historical authority. There's reasons why, right? For the most part, we agree with the biblical books that are there. It's not hard to see why the early Christian authorities or religious Christian authorities, because some of them may or may not have been, right? But they're a part of the authority. So either way, the fact is, there are reasons why they chose certain books. And they're the same reasons why we would probably choose these same books. They're the best books. And even though there are other letters and books, they just don't have the same degree of historical manuscript or referential authority by early writers. So I think the Epistle of Barnabas, it should be considered, right? If you think this is something that isn't quite the standard of the New Testament, wait till we get to the letters of Ignatius, right? So either way, we do have some good authority for the Epistle of Barnabas. And if it is the apostle, then obviously it's something we need to take very seriously, right? He's spoken of in very high terms, even though Paul confronted him and said, basically, he was following Peter and doing what he was doing wrongly in Galatians. Excuse me. Barnabas is still, even though Paul and him got in an argument over John, who's also called Mark, right? So in spite of those things, Barnabas was still very much a respected authority and figure. Because why? We're all imperfect, right? Even Paul. Sometimes people refer to Paul and talk about Paul like he's more perfect than Jesus, Paul was not even close to Jesus, right? He even admitted all that. But yet none of us are. We all have issues and things we're dealing with, but yet we can manifest the Christ, and through doing so we can seem like we're better than we really are, right? Which is a good thing. That's what we want. So either way, let's get to the selections that I have for us, and we'll read them to determine in particular what the early Christian view as reflected in the letter of Barnabas is on Jesus, and then also some other stuff that came up as I reviewed the letter. Good to see Everett, Henry, Betsy, and everybody else who joins us or who watches the video later. Epistle of Barnabas, written between 70 and 132 CE, possibly the actual apostle Barnabas, not one of the 12, but one of the apostles named in the New Testament, Acts 14:14, accepted by such by several early Christian writers, as I said, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, not so much Eusebius. And so we have Greek and Latin authorities from the 4th century, including Codex Sinaiticus, some question about certain parts, in particular the final chapters. So all this should be taken into consideration as you rely on or consider the importance of this material or anything else that we read. All right. Epistle of Barnabas. Now I'm going to be, the numbering I'm going to be referring to is going to be based on this online source right here. Let me bring it up, and it's going to adjust, I think, the cam thing here a little bit. Let me do this here. When I read this, I'll go ahead and line this up like that. But I'll be using this source. I'll put a link in the description below so you can read this online source if you'd like. And I believe it's the same translation that you would find, for example, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series. This is volume 1, published by Hendrickson. There are other series out there. And then you also have the Kersop Lake Apostolic Fathers 2-volume set, published as part of the Loeb Classical Library series. It gives you the Greek and the English translation across the page from each other. We'll be taking a look at that in a moment as well. All right, so let's go ahead and bring back up our selections. I'm going to adjust this so that we're better there. All right, and so the source I just showed you is what the numbering that I'm referring to in this selection of material from the letter of Barnabas corresponds to, okay? Epistle of Barnabas 1:12. I then, not as your teacher, but as one of yourselves, will set forth a few things by which in present circumstances ye may be rendered the more joyful. So he refers to the present circumstances that, if you keep in mind, we may get to later the part where he describes the temple and its condition. So I want to note that here so we can refer back to it. And then in 4:25 through 26, the final stumbling block or source of danger approaches, concerning which it is written, as Enoch says, for this end the Lord has cut short the times and the days, that his beloved may hasten, and he will come to the inheritance. I wanted to highlight this part here to show that in the Epistle of Barnabas, he, like Jude, refers to Enoch. And so, as we know, we do have several books, right? First Enoch, Second Enoch, Third Enoch. And, we do have, for First Enoch at least, some ancient authority, right? Even fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But outside of those fragments and some Greek texts, we don't have a really good, complete, historically reliable text of First Enoch, Second Enoch, or Third Enoch. So that's why if you pick up, a source like Charles or Charlesworth, both of which containing English translations of First, Second, and I believe also Third Enoch, when you read them, a lot of it is hard to understand, right? It seems a little complex. Not a lot of it makes complete sense. And I think a lot of that has to do with the transmission of the text, right? And so, nevertheless, we have biblical and potentially an apostolic association in the letter of Barnabas, also together with Jude, that's the biblical reference to Enoch, referring to that source. So the book or books of Enoch were no joke, everybody, right? We have fragments of them in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. I have a little series. I think there's 2 or 3 videos in it, and I'll probably do more. Maybe I'll put this as one little part. They're small, short videos, but it's about the book of Enoch, books of Enoch in the Bible, I think. It's on one of my playlists about the Bible and early ancient texts. Either way, I talk a little bit about some of these, the importance of some of these associations. So I wanted to highlight that here. In the other videos, it was more about the reference in Jude. All right, and then not too long after referring to the book of Enoch, in the Epistle of Barnabas 4:35 through 37, do not, by retiring apart, live a solitary life, right? He's talking to Christians here. As if you were already fully justified, but coming together in one place, make common inquiry concerning what tends to your general welfare. I wanted to stop there and highlight this because, this is consistent with what we read in the book of Hebrews and what I think all of us as Christians believe is important and that we want to do, right? Gathering together in one place if possible, right? This is one place. It's online. But this is just the only way we can do it because, we're not all right next to each other, right? So we have the means today in order to overcome that and still be in one place. If we can't do that, or if we don't have the technological means is what I mean, we should try to cultivate close nearby associations, even if it's just 1 or 2, right? We don't need to have this gigantic community right away. That's a good goal. That may come later, but let's just start with a couple, right? That's what Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered. So I don't see why that number should be of any concern to anybody. That's a good number. If Jesus is there at that number, that's your number right there. Anything over that number is like bonus. And so if we can, and however we can, we come together in one place. This has always been Christian doctrine. Nobody advocates doing so otherwise. Some groups, as we know, overemphasize this in ways that make it a requirement. The very thing that Barnabas and Peter were confronted by Paul of doing, right? Making people kind of basically subject to the law again, requiring people to do things versus just setting an example and letting them do what they feel like compelled to do. Right? There are some groups that basically, if you don't do every single thing they do in terms of how often you come together in one place, right? They'll use this again. Oh, you're not coming together in one place. Well, we just did, though. We just did last Sunday. We were all online together, talking to each other, chatting. We came together locally when we can. Yeah, but we do it several times a week. You got to do it every time. Well, where does it say that? Why do I have to come every single time you say it's necessary when the things you're going to talk about are things we pretty much already know, or that are new things that are like weird and stuff and we don't need to know, when we should be helping the poor, taking care of the lowly, and building each other up in love and helping each other get through each day, right? Reinforcing positive doctrine, clear evidence about the Messiah, about God. Not all this prophetic and chronological stuff. I mean, that stuff, right? That keeps people in survival mode, right? Everyone there at any moment, right? It's like that makes people traumatized because they're trying to live and survive, and yet at the same time they think, well, we're going to die at any moment. So you're in this constant state of tension within yourself about what to do, and more or less the different personalities, right? For different personalities. But the fact is, different groups, I'm not just referring to one here, but I think it could fit to several, take this kind of simple thing and ruin it, right? Make it a compelling obligation, a burden on people, and fill the burdensome obligations with things you're not even supposed to be talking about anyway. We're not even supposed to be talking about that stuff. And you're making it a requirement for us to go this often to hear it? We should be out helping people, I think, a little bit more. Not trying to figure out how close the end is, right? It was just, how about we just praise God, the Christ, and help other people, and when the end comes, it comes. Seems like the right way. That's the way the Bible teaches, right? It's not just my way. Either way, let's continue. For the scripture saith, woe to them who are wise to themselves and prudent in their own sight. Right, I'm reading 4:35 through 37 according to the numbering system of the letter I showed you a moment ago that I'll link down below. Let us be spiritually minded. Let us be a perfect temple to God. As much as in us lies, let us meditate upon the fear of God. And let us keep his commandments, that we may rejoice in his ordinances. The Lord will judge the world without respect of persons, right? Meaning, doesn't matter what you are on the outside. All those exterior things that at times are enough to sway most people, or many people, they don't mean a thing to his eyes, right? Jehovah's eyes, he sees everything. His spirit, right? This, as the Epistle of Barnabas refers to, is just a vessel. So he's not even considering it, right? Other than in the basic ways in which he knows we're all made. Each will receive as he has done, right? As we read throughout the New Testament, from Jesus, Paul, James, Revelation. If he is righteous, his righteousness will precede him. If he is wicked, the reward of wickedness is before him. Right? See, this is all pretty, isn't this basic and seem like it's consistent in its tone and content? Right? Again, we have some question about some of the material, but not all of it. And certainly it was considered something very early on, right? This is almost 2,000 years old. Well, let's see. So we'll say 1,600 years old. I don't want to round up too far. But that's a long time, right? It's over 1,500 years ago. And if this is the Apostle Barnabas, than when he originally wrote this is closer to almost 2,000 years ago. And consistent with everything else that we read from that time. Chapter 5, verses 39 through 40. And further, my brethren, if the Lord endured to suffer for our soul, he being Lord of all the world, to whom God setteth the foundation of the world, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, right? Genesis 1:26. We've been talking about this a little bit in our Hebrew plurals and the Trinity videos. Understand how it was that he endured to suffer at the hands of men. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere, right? Now we're getting a little bit more Christological, theological, in terms of the kind of metaphysical things we can glean from the letter of Barnabas in terms of the early Christian views of Jesus. Right, we got all the stuff we already know about the Lord judged. A lot of this isn't controversial, really. Now here, here he says, he refers to Jesus, right? We know it's Jesus because it says, the Lord endured to suffer for our soul. He being Lord of all the world. To whom? God said, at the foundation of the world. Now, Trinitarians say that in the beginning is in eternity, right? Even though in the beginning, John 1:1, it's the same in the beginning of Genesis 1:1. That's talking about the physical beginning of the heavens and the earth. Where according to John 1:1, of course, the Word was already there. And Job 38:1 through 7, the sons of God, Jesus being one of the sons of God, were there during the time when all of the things that are described in Genesis 1 and John 1, by the way, occurred. And here in the letter of Barnabas, we have two things, right? He refers to that beginning as the foundation of the world. When God said, let us make man after our image, right? And in the biblical sense, that is foundation of the world. That is what refers to, that is a reference to the beginning of humanity, basically, right? It can also refer to, obviously, the foundations of the earth itself and things like that, like in Job and elsewhere. But here, clearly, at the time when God created humankind, which is referred to as the foundation of the world, right? Not earlier than that, Trinitarians, not like in eternity or, an earlier time, and before the foundation of the world can be before the time when the throwing down of seed occurs, right? So at the foundation of the world here can be a period of time where God creates the first human couple, but they haven't really had any children yet. And in the strictest biblical sense, you will find the reference foundation of the world is when the children actually begin to multiply, when offspring occur. The throwing down of seed, right? There's been a creation. This is where it begins, you could say, where the foundation of the world in terms of the throwing down of seed, it has to start with the parents, right? So they have to be made first. The whole intention of God, I believe, of course, and certainly at one point when he made Eve, was that they would reproduce, right? I guess you could say he may have considered continuously forming different humans from the earth, but at some point he believed Adam needed Eve and used those two and their compatible natures and features to throw down seed into the earth, right? To found the earth with children. But before that could happen, we know what took place, right? That's why there are times when the Bible refers to before the foundation of the earth, right? Before the throwing down of seed. I'm going to do a show about this coming up. I've talked about it in my writings, of course. I talked about it with Dr. Maury. But before Adam and Eve had children, before the throwing down of seed, before that part of the foundation of the world, God, of course, rebuked Adam and Eve and the devil and prophesied about the seed. The seed in connection with whom there would be many, not just one. We'll get to that in another day, but I wanted to bring it up here. Now notice also, it's very clear, it identifies Jesus, right, the Lord who suffered, as the one that God is talking to. Now remember, in my Hebrew plurals and the Trinity videos, I made it very clear that the Trinitarians' understanding of the plural in 126, not every Trinitarian believes this. Some realize it doesn't work, but many seem to go with it still. If it's a plural, then it means gods, something they don't even believe. But if it's a plural of dignification, of respect, an intense plural that's not meant to be taken as a numerical plural, just like when it's used for humans or for others, like David, like Rehoboam, like Moses, like for inanimate or for non-living objects, things like trees, where the trees are living but being non-humans. You can see my parts 1 and 2, and I'll have another show coming on that soon. If God is a plural there, the way Trinitarians want, he's talking to somebody else. So this would make the Son, the Lord that's referred to here as the object of God talking, not a member of the Trinity. This is exactly what I'm talking about, illustrated in that video. Right? Here you have God talking. Well, if God is a plural, the way Trinitarians want, that would have to be the Trinity talking. But that's not even possible, right? Because it would have to be one of the persons talking. That's called a plural form of the word God, which is the case. It's just not a real plural. But the way they talk about it, they end up either creating this fourth person out of the nature of God, or contradicting themselves because they don't believe God, one of the persons of God, is a Trinity, which would have to be the one who's talking, the one who's called God in the plural, right? I talked about it in parts 1 and 2. And clearly here, the one who's talking, who's called Elohim, is separated from the Lord, the one who suffered. And it's explicit in the next example, I believe, or in one coming up. Yeah, maybe not the next one, but the one after. Let's look at the next one, though. 5:41 through 43. Then he manifested. So clearly, though, we can tell from 5:39 through 40, what? That early Christian document, the Epistle of Barnabas, potentially written by the Apostle Barnabas, believed in the pre-existence of the Son, correct? And also that he was separate from God, which is why John 1:1 says the Word was with God, right? Just like you see right here. He's with the God who's talking there, Trinitarians. It's not a person of God talking to another person of God, and only one of them is called God in the plural. Trinitarians, sometimes what you guys do, I don't know. Anyway, bad teaching. Sometimes you guys everyone has bad teachers. You guys have had a few, to say the least. And some of that false doctrine is just hard to get rid of. I know. I get it. 5:41 through 43. Then he manifested himself to be the Son of God. For if he had not come in the flesh, how could men have been saved by beholding him? Since looking upon the Son, which is to cease to exist, and is the work of his hands, their eyes are not able to bear his rays. I'm glad you liked the video, Betsy. It's a good one. The Son of God therefore came in the flesh with this view, that he might bring to a head the sum of their sins who had persecuted his prophets to the death. For this purpose, then, he endured. Now, I think this is significant because, of course, it's very clear that he refers to him as the Son of God twice here, as coming in the flesh. And he talks elsewhere about giving his flesh, the vehicle of his flesh, in sacrifice to God, just like in the letter of Hebrews. Some people believe that the letter of Barnabas and the author of Hebrews are the same because they use some similar references and phraseology. I didn't find them to be very similar in those respects. I mean, there's some similarities, but not in the ways I would expect for it to be with a document. Right? We all sometimes write a little differently. Sometimes these writing analyses I don't think really are accurate, we'll say the least. But either way, sometimes we write a little differently, especially I think in shorter things, because we're just trying to get a quick message across, right? Depends on what you're trying to get across, right? What's your state of mind at the time, how much time you have, who are you writing to. But when you're writing something really detailed and long, I think that's when some similarities come out the most, right? Because you have the time, it's lengthy, your style is more likely to show through in more areas of your thinking and penmanship, right? The way you put your thoughts into words in writing. The more material, the longer the letter, the more familiar you are with your audience. I think the style is going to be pretty consistent. Not exact all the time, right? We have different. I write things differently. I don't write the exact same thing all the time. I don't think anybody does. There are definitely styles, though. So, either way, we were talking about the writing styles, right? The things of Barnabas in the letter of Hebrews. So, and some people refer to the letter of Barnabas as anonymous, but in Codex Sinaiticus, in fact, let me pull this up real quickly. I'll put a link to this below as well. This is an online version of Codex Sinaiticus. You can go here and you can see a facsimile edition online. You can search it, right? If you go up here, if you look at this upper left area right here, you can see I've got it open to the letter of Barnabas, chapter 1, verse 1. This is basically the area right here that I'm circling with my cursor, what I made the thumbnail out of. But do you see right above that, right here, this area I'm circling with my cursor right now? That identifies it as a letter of Barnabas. So I think there is, I don't think it's as anonymous, although you could say the same about the letter of Hebrews, right? But this is more of a name, whereas Hebrews is more of a ethnicity, right? So I think there is some identification here. I don't think it's quite anonymous as people think. But either way, if you want to look at the letter of Barnabas according to Codex Sinaiticus of the 4th century, it's right here. You can come and take a look at it, right? You can move it around. You can check different areas. You can make it bigger. And it'll show you over here a transcription of different parts right here. Right? If you pick a spot, this is the beginning of it right here. So that's a resource you can consider. Go ahead and bring up the selections material. Let me make this a little bigger as well. Right, and you can also, like I was saying earlier, if you take the Cursop Lake edition, right, you can look at it. You have a Greek transcription on the left side, and then you can go to the Codex Sinaiticus. It'll make it easier for you if you're not as familiar with it. There are ways you can combine these different tools, take a closer look at different things, like we will in a moment, and just get a full sense of everything you want to know. All right. Let's read now. Okay, now this one here, this is another Genesis 1:26 reference in the letter of Barnabas. Chapter 6, 66 through 67, it says, "For the scripture says concerning us, while he speaks to the Son, let us make man after our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the beasts of the earth and the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, right? Of course, as we know in the New Testament, as Jesus teaches, he doesn't do anything unless he sees what the Father does. And then he does it in like manner, right? Homoios. Not exact Trinitarian, sorry. Very specific term there. You can't ignore that. And it's temporally distinct, right? He has to see the Father do it. He has to learn. He has to watch the Father, Trinitarians. So when God, right, the one you call a plural of persons, speaks to the Son, which would mean the Son is not part of the plural of persons that's talking to it, if we take the plural of persons the way you say it should be taken. Either way, see parts 1 and 2, Hebrew plurals in the Trinity for more on that. Here it talks about God, the God of Genesis 1, talking to the Son, saying, let's make man in our image. We've got texts like Proverbs 8, Micah 5, Revelation 3:14, Colossians 1:15 through 17, Hebrews 1 through 12, that teach very clearly, 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 6, that Jesus was with God, not just there applauding like the other sons of God and other potentially passive ways, but in a passively active way, right? Passive in the sense that God is doing something through him, right? Just like he's subjecting all things to him, 1 Peter 3:22, and just like, according to John chapter 14, he's working through the Son. He's doing his works through the Son. It's not the Son's works, Trinitarians. In the same way, God is working through the Son in the Genesis 1 period, doing his works. They're not the Son's works, just like the John 14 works are not the Son's works. It's the Father doing them through the Son. Same thing. And then the Son is able to do it in like manner, just like wisdom expresses delight and joy over being able to do in the presence of her Father, of her Creator, right? Yahuwah created me, Trinitarians. It's very explicit in the Hebrew and Greek, kana, ketizo. And then all the descriptive terms that, of course, involve being knit together, right? Being put together like a child. Everything temporal. And then, of course, the direct association, Trinitarians, of Proverbs 8:35 and the goings forth, right? The exodoi. That is a direct relationship marker with Micah 5 about the Messiah who would stand and shepherd in the name of his God, whose goings forth, whose exodoi, Trinitarians, are from earlier times, the times that wisdom is talking about in Proverbs 8, all fits together, everybody, perfectly. So much so that Barnabas just referenced it, right? It's like, no big deal. Yeah, God's talking to the Son. Yeah, you know how John was talking about the Word being in the beginning right there? That's the beginning of Genesis 1:1. It should be obvious to everyone. Oh, you've got some Trinitarians that think that's eternity? Well, it's not, right? So we just go with the Bible, right? We're not here for this other stuff, later doctrine. We got to look for it, though, right? We know it's in there. We know we're going to get to it. It's just not here yet, right? We've been looking at different early Christian writers, right? So far, we're not getting anywhere near the kind of metaphysic that comes from Trinity or Trinitarian thinking. All right. Everything again so far, very clear, very consistent with what the Bible teaches. There are distinctions between God, the Son. There's going to be more coming up here on that same roll. Very consistent with what the Bible teaches. 674 through 77. He was to be manifested in the flesh and to sojourn among us, right? John 1:14. For my brethren, the habitation of our heart is a holy temple to the Lord. For again, saith the Lord, And wherewith shall I appear before the Lord my God and be glorified? Right? So right there, he's talking about the one who was manifested in the flesh. That's Jesus, right? For my brethren, the habitation of ours is a holy temple to the Lord. For again saith the Lord, talking about Jesus, right? The one who was manifested in the flesh. Again saith the Lord, and wherewith shall I appear before the Lord my God and be glorified? Right? Which would be if he's quoting, I'd have to look at the source here. In fact, let's take a quick look. This is one benefit that you will find if you combine the online edition that we're using now, and if you get a copy of the printed edition of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. One benefit, really, the Kearsarge Lake edition has good stuff too, in particular the Greek text in English. But one benefit of the Hendrickson, the older series of translations of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, including the Epistle of Barnabas, is the footnotes. Okay, now they're not always the most accurate, right? Because they're like over 100 years old, so they're not going to have the benefit of a lot of the manuscripts and things that we have found, Dead Sea Scrolls, papyri, things like that. But they do have a lot of information about the text related to these documents, and at least what they were doing with them. And so let's take a look at 674. The other thing you can use this for, and this is very important with the letter of Barnabas, is to identify what is a biblical quotation. Sometimes in the letter of Barnabas, there's what seem to be quotations, but we're not familiar with a text that has that material. Sometimes they're like combinations of texts, like I'll show you in a moment. So you may come across like a text in the Epistle of Barnabas and be like, well, where's that text? Well, it may not exist in any known text that we have, or it may be a combination. So I'll get to that in a moment, but first, let's take a look at what the source of this reference is. 6. You can also use it again, as I said, to find out what the source material is. So if we go to chapter 6, and I'll look for the same reference here. There's the Genesis 1:1 quote. And so we're looking for he was to be manifested. All right, so that goes to 67. Okay. Manifested in the flesh. Let's see if I can find this real quick, because I had to take this out of that source I showed you earlier. So I'm trying to look up the actual quotation. Okay, I found it. Page 141. For again the Lord saith, and where shall I appear before the Lord my God and be glorified? So it's a reference, it's a quote from, well, it says compare Psalm 52:2. Let's do that. Psalm 52:2. So if you take a copy of a Septuagint, right now I've got a copy of Brenton's Septuagint. It also has the Greek and English. I use Rolf's when I do translating, though, because it has a better text and more manuscript references. So if we go to Psalm, what was that reference? Let's see how similar they are, because I want to show you guys how this works sometimes with the Epistle of Barnabas and some of the quotes, right? And some of this may be due to us not having the best text, even though we do have it in Sinaiticus and a 4th century Latin in large part. Nevertheless, there could be some issues, or it may be we don't have every text that represents what was considered a biblical authority during the first century or early second century when this was written, right? There are times when what's quoted in the New Testament it's usually represented to some extent in part of the Septuagint tradition, but sometimes there's things that aren't there or that we consider maybe translated by the New Testament writers. Either way, they may have actually had a text that read this way. So we want to look at Psalm 42:2 and see how similar that is. Psalm 42:2. Let's take a look here. Psalm 42:2. Brenton's translation is, "My soul has thirsted for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" So if this is, in fact, what this is based on, or it could be in the Psalms is right, there's Psalm 42 or 43 in brackets or parentheses because of the different numbering system in the Greek and Hebrew. It could be verse 2 from what is 42:43 verses 41:42, which says, "For thou, O God, art my strength, wherefore thou hast cast me off. Why do I go sad of countenance while the enemy oppresses me?" So these are Psalms of David. It may be, again, that in the Epistle of Barnabas, they're referring to some of these texts or references and making a quotation out of them. But some of them are just not easy to find, right? So there's not really a quotation we can point to in the New or Old Testaments to justify what he's saying here. It says, "For again saith the Lord." And he's talking about the Lord who manifested in the flesh, the Lord saying, "And wherewith shall I appear before the Lord my God," right? Basically doing the same thing that Jesus does when he's being put to death, right? He says, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" Or like he says in John 20:17, right? "My Father and your Father, my God and your God." Or like he says in Revelation 3:2 and 12, right? "Make you a pillar in the temple of my God." Right? He says it over and over again. So this is the same thing. I mean, this is the same thing we're getting here. We're getting the Epistle of Barnabas presenting a quotation as if Jesus said this. Maybe he did, right? If this is really Barnabas, he would know, right? He would know more than we do about what was actually said. But we don't have an actual reference to justify this beyond that, beyond recognizing that if this is Barnabas, he would know that that's what the Lord said. All right. So again, everything we're reading here, guys, consistent, guys and gals. By guys, sometimes I mean, gender neutral. Just a colloquialism, right? It's a reference. Common expression. I think I saw Bankhead in there also. Let's see who else is in. Miro and George. We got Betsy, Henry, Everett. Thank you all for joining me. I hope it's been a good show. As you know, we're looking at early Christian views of Jesus, right? What did they believe? What did the text that we have today to represent early Christianity after the New Testament, or at least right from it, right? Like with Clement or with Barnabas, there may be some documents that actually were written in part or in whole by New Testament figures. And we're within, 100 years of a lot of New Testament activity, even the life of Jesus, depending on when some of these things were written. And I think we're putting together a really good picture so far. And so far, everything has been consistent with what we believe is taught in the New Testament. So it's really no surprise to us, is it, that this is what we find in a letter attributed to Barnabas. that has pretty ancient authority. All right. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I said he refers to sacrificing his flesh like it also does in Hebrews. In the letter of Barnabas 7:84, it says, he also himself was able to offer and sacrifice for our sins the vessel of the Spirit. Right? What's the vessel of the Spirit? Excuse me. Right? Our flesh, right? Our body. In order that the type established in Isaac, when he was offered upon the altar, might be fully accomplished. Right? So this is again consistent with our understanding of what happened to Jesus' body. He was raised to life as a life-giving spirit. His spirit went to the Father when he died, was given a new body, a spiritual body, in which he appeared to the spirits in prison. Right? 1 Corinthians 15:45, 1 Peter 3:18 and 19. And then on the third day after he was killed, he raised his physical body out of the tomb and appeared in it and in other forms to many people before returning to the right hand of the Father, where he was given all authority and power and the Holy Spirit. And after which he appeared to people like Paul in brilliant bright light and John in the exact or nearly exact, right? Like just one slight difference with regard to the eyes and there being in the face and there being lightning and fire as part of the countenance, right? Almost exactly. Jesus is described exactly in his spiritual body in Revelation 1:12 through 16, like I believe he is, and the other spirit being in Daniel chapter 10, right? So everything fits together. We don't need this two-nature, later doctrine stuff that contradicts itself, that actually splits up Jesus' natures, right? Which they accuse us of doing. They're the ones who do it. The whole point of them saying, well, when he says he doesn't know the day or the hour, he's talking from his human nature. Well, that's splitting up his natures then, right? If he's just one person, then one person knows or doesn't know all things. It's that simple. One nature can't hide something from the other nature. Otherwise, you have two persons, one that knows this and one that knows that. See, they're the ones splitting him up. You can't have that. There's nothing taught in the Bible or outside of it that would justify what they're talking about. It's an absurdity because that's what their doctrine has come to. Their metaphysic. It's an invention. It's not taught in the Bible. Letter of Barnabas, chapter 9, 125 through 130. For the scripture saith, and Abraham circumcised 10, and 8, and 300 men of his household. What then was the knowledge given to him in this? Learn the 18 first, and then the 300. The 10 and the 8 are thus denoted, 10 by I, 8 by H. You have the initials of the name of Jesus. And because the cross was to express the grace of our redemption by the letter T, he says also 300. He signifies, therefore, Jesus by 2 letters and the cross by 1. Okay, so as you know, I think the evidence in the Bible is inconclusive, and the evidence from archaeology is also inconclusive. It could go either way, right? You could have Jesus being executed on a straight up pole or stake or tree with his hands over his head and nailed from the sides, just like we have archaeological evidence showing the feet were placed on each side of the base of the tree or the pole of the stake and nailed from the sides. Or you could have it to where Jesus had his hands out, either on a piece of wood that he brought to an area where there was a tree and they nailed the piece of wood on the tree, or, he was put up on a cross or T-shaped execution form. Look, everybody, it makes no difference to us. I don't see why it would. What would it make a difference? Right? Does it make any difference? It's the Romans who put him to death. If the Romans wanted to use a T-shaped cross, whether it was for Tammuz or not, who cares? What does that have anything to do with us or with Jesus? It doesn't. It doesn't change anything. I don't know why we ever really argue about it other than the fact that we're all trying to figure out what was correct, right? We want to be accurate. And then, of course, Trinitarians and others freak out over torture stakes, Stauros in the New World Translation. So they're the ones who attack it and then us by extension. And so we have to defend it. And we're like, well, who cares? Who cares anyway? It is a potential meaning of the term. You just don't agree with it because of your historical adoption of it as part of your tradition and really idolatry, right? You use it in religious veneration all the time. Constantine claimed he was given the sign divinely in a vision, in a dream. So you guys are nuts, right? You guys are using visual things in ways that are nowhere represented in the Bible to us. Now, I will say this. I believe this represents an early piece of evidence that supports the use of a cross or a T-shaped instrument. Right? Once again, we have manuscript authority to the 4th century, 300s. We have pretty good authority early on that ascribes this to the Apostle Barnabas. We do have some issues, so we can't say for sure, but either way, I would chalk this up as a piece of early evidence for the use of a cross. Christian Clarity asks, why do you not believe in a physical resurrection, especially in light of him eating and other things? Well, I made it very clear I actually do believe in a physical resurrection, but that's after he was raised to life as a spirit. Why do you not believe he was raised to life as a spirit? It says so explicitly. Pneuma, 1 Corinthians 15:45. So why don't you believe that, Christian Clarity? Why do you refuse to believe he was raised as a life-giving spirit? In which form he went to speak to other spirits. 1 Peter 3:18 and 19. Often mistranslated by some of your Bibles by Trinitarians or others. Whether you are or not, that may be another issue. As far as him eating, why did the angels in the Old Testament eat with Abraham? Genesis 18 and 19. It says they ate with Abraham. And I believe also with Lot. Angels can manifest physical form. They've been doing it since Genesis. And there are many people who believe that one of those angels was Jesus. So either way, though, angels clearly have the power to eat. Why didn't they recognize Jesus? Clarity, Christian Clarity. They didn't recognize him right away. It was the way he broke the bread. They didn't recognize any wounds on his hands. They didn't recognize his face. They didn't recognize his voice. Because he appeared in different forms. It even says that in Mark, I believe, that he appeared in a different form. And of course, Mary couldn't recognize him. It was only when he called her name in a very specific way. Right, Clarity. And so Jesus became physical for a specific reason as well. He took on his resurrected physical form, appeared in it to Thomas. He appeared in a locked room, by the way, something a physical body couldn't do unless it was being supernaturally manipulated. Then he appeared in other forms. Christian Clarity, why does it say in Revelation 12, 1:12 through 16, that he's in the exact same form as other spirit beings, which is not physical in any way, shape, or form, other than representationally? He's described in anything but physical forms, and he's not described as having wound marks or in any way resembling the body that you say he was first resurrected in. You're the one who has to reject what the Bible teaches about his spiritual resurrection, about his spiritual proclamation of victory to the spirits, and then on the third day he resurrected his physical body. Galatians 1:1 says the Father raised him from the dead. Jesus, when he was dying, said, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. So the Father had to give him life according to Galatians 1:1. Read it yourself. But then Jesus in John 2:19 says, tear down this temple, 2:19 through 21, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. There's a couple ways you could look at it, but to me it seems pretty simple. The Father resurrected Jesus, just like Galatians 1:1 says. And after he was made alive in the Spirit, he raised up his physical body just like he said. Anyway, I appreciate your question. I'm sure you're well-meaning. But I'm trying to, and I did get into it a little bit, so that's okay. I think you're on topic. No problem. Either way, we may not agree, but hopefully that at least helps you understand my position. All right. I actually think you get probably, if you believe Jesus was killed on a cross, I think this is a piece of evidence on your side. I think the letter of Barnabas is something that you could cite as a part of your evidence. Although it goes on to talk about, I think we'll see in the selections that I made, it goes on to talk about something that would contradict that very conclusion, right? So while if this is written by the Apostle Barnabas, I would give that serious weight, right? If I was sure, and I'm not sure, no one's sure. That's why it's not part of the Bible. And early on was questioned, outside of Clement of Alexandria and Origen. If I had more confidence this was written by Barnabas, I would accept that Jesus was put to death on a T or a cross. Again, what's the difference, everybody? Does that change anything for you? Right? You don't, if you're like me, you don't run around wearing and praying to crosses or through using crosses or stakes, right? Most of us don't do that, at least here. I mean, I guess some of us might, but I don't see that it changes anything. The Romans put him to death. They could have used anything they want. Maybe it was a cross, right? But the evidence is not conclusive. And the way Trinitarians and others attack the New World Translation, that's not fair, right? Because it isn't so clear. Now, if we accept the Epistle of Barnabas, I think it gets more clear. Okay, but it's not accepted. I will consider it as definitely a piece of evidence in favor of a T or a cross-shaped instrument. Chapter 12, 161 through 163. In like manner, he points to the cross of Christ. Now, remember, even though it did say cross in terms of the T, this is an English translation, right? So not every word just means cross. But I think following what he just said about the T, there's no problem there. Now hang on, though. He points to the cross of Christ and another prophet who saith, and when shall these things be accomplished? And the Lord saith, when a tree shall be bent down and again rise, and when blood shall flow out of wood. Here again you have an intimation concerning the cross and him who should be crucified. Now, we go to that section in the Hendrickson edition of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, chapter 12, and look and see where that reference is. The reference part where it says, when a tree shall be bent down and again arise, and when blood shall flow out of wood. The reference on page 144, it's kind of tiny. Now, the note is note 19. It says, from some unknown apocryphal book. Okay? So again, here's another example of either the letter of Barnabas quoting a source we don't have, but that they used, which is probably the case, right? I mean, it's not likely that these early sources, or any source, right, would just invent a source. I guess it's possible. But in this context, right, what would it prove? If he couldn't reference something to the people he's writing to, as the Christians did, that was the whole point, right? To be able to say, hey, here it says this, here it says that. And, there would be interpretations at times, but basically, the credibility comes from being able to cite the information. So I think there was definitely some source. Now, there's another reference we're going to get to that's kind of a combination that's kind of interesting in light of our pre-Christian evidence. Jesus is the biblical Messiah. But I wanted to share this with you because, there's several other instances like this for both the Latin and the Greek, where we're not really sure what's going on. Where they're either what they're quoting or the text itself is a little difficult. So you need to keep that in mind. As I said earlier, right, that you would read some things, if you read this letter, some things you would read and think, well, where's that in the Bible, right? Where's that in any ancient text? Well, we don't know sometimes. Sometimes several, and it's not just once or twice, it's several times, some of the quotations appear to be from a source we don't have right now, or a version of, say, the Psalms we don't have representation of. But I believe whoever wrote this did. 12, 172, 176. Moreover, Moses, when he commanded, ye shall not have any graven or molten image for your God, did so that he might reveal a type of Jesus. Moses then makes a brazen serpent and places it upon a beam, and by proclamation assembles the people. When therefore they were come together, they besought Moses that he would offer sacrifice in their behalf and pray for their recovery. And Moses spake unto them, saying, when any one of you is bitten, let him come to the serpent placed on the pole, and let him hope and believe that even though dead, it is able to give him life, and immediately he shall be restored. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the Kearsarge Lake edition. It's the most convenient way to check the Greek text, although you could look at the Codex Sinaiticus online like I showed you earlier. But if we look at chapter 12, I have another section here marked that we're going to get to probably in a moment. Let's go to this one. Chapter 12. And so you can see here what's happening. Right now we're getting the letter of Barnabas referring to the account in the Old Testament where Moses put a serpent on a pole. Now, the way it's described here, right, it says places it upon a beam, not a cross. It's not translated cross like this is translated cross up here. And down here it's translated place the serpent on the pole. Serpent placed on the pole, not cross. So if we accept that both references, right, this one here and this one here about the T and the cross, we accept both of these are original, and whether by Barnabas or not, just original part of the document. How could we harmonize this? Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's possible, right? The New Testament says, and even part of the prophecies involved being hung on a tree, right? The New Testament uses the word for tree, zilon, which can also mean a club, right? Even in the context, like I talk about in one of my cross stake pole videos. So you could have Jesus carrying a pole or an upright instrument, right? A piece of wood big enough to nail on a tree. And so it could be both, right? It could be that just like you have in that context, right? You have zilon used of a club, the club that the people came to arrest him with. They clearly weren't crosses, right? And then, of course, we know the prophecy fulfilled talks about him dying on a tree, which is a zilon. And of course, also stauros is used, which could mean cross or pole. So if both of these are correct, right? If one is not an interpolation and and the other one isn't, right? Which we're not sure, but they're both in the Latin and Greek texts of the 4th century. Then I would say we're dealing with something where Jesus probably carried a piece of wood to Golgotha, and they used it to nail him to a tree, so that he probably was either outstretched or that piece of wood, right? A tree isn't always linear, right? Right? If you find a tree out there, sometimes it might be straight enough, I guess, to nail someone to, like straight up, and have a beam up for their hands. But it may also be that they needed a piece of wood to place behind him. But if the reference to the T is accurate, there would still be the hands placed out, even if they were nailed to the tree, right? Or nailed. No, they wouldn't. For the T to be accurate, I think you would have to have the hands outstretched somehow. So again, it's a big if, because this isn't canonical, but it's not to be ignored either. But I think it could be harmonized if we accept both of these references as genuine letter of Barnabas and even apostolic. I think you could have Jesus that carried a piece of wood to Golgotha, nailed to a tree, and who cares if his hands were outstretched or not, right? Why is that such a big deal? That doesn't change anything at all to me. And again, we can't override the New Testament evidence necessarily for a 4th century version of the letter of Barnabas and criticize the New World Translation because of it, right? Just because it may be a good piece of evidence, that's not enough. But let's take a look real quick here. So what does it say in 12:172? Right, so we know the translation here is not cross, where it's talking about how the serpent was put on the pole or beam by Moses. And here, on page 385 of volume 1 of the Apostolic Fathers in the Loeb Classical Library edition, he says, so they came together, and it's a little bit different translation. In this case, where it says here, serpent placed on the pole, in what I believe is the Ante-Nicene Fathers edition. In the Loeb Classical Library edition, it says, the serpent placed upon the tree. And the word is zilon. Epiton often ton epitu zilu. So that word is tree right there, zilon, for the serpent. That would be inconsistent, and again, unless we're talking a piece of wood nailed to a tree. To me, that satisfies pretty much everything, and hopefully everyone, but you never know, right? Let's see what the first reference is. This beam right here. Okay, so this word is zilon. And then just above that, it's a little bit different translation here. It says, where it says here, you shall not have any graven or molten image of your God. Moses, when he commanded, did so that he might reveal a type of Jesus. Moses makes a brazen serpent, places it upon a beam. Here it says, ye shall have neither graven nor molten image for your God, yet he makes one of himself to show a type of Jesus. Moses therefore makes a graven serpent and places it in honor and calls the people by a proclamation. And that is basically what it says, right? Moses kalkun ofin kai tithesin endoxos. So I guess if you're looking up at a serpent, right? If you're considering a serpent in an elevated position as one you need to look to in order to be saved, that's putting it in a position of honor, right? So we get in the Greek text here a term that basically involves honoring it, and then a term that involves putting it on a tree or a xylon, right? And what does this prefigure, everyone? Right? This is about the Messiah here. That's why Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, right? So when you've lifted up the Son of Man, it prefigures the Messiah, again, showing the connection also with these serpentine beings, right? The seraphim, right? Fiery flying serpents. Satan, of course, presented as a serpent in the garden, the original serpent in Revelation. So there's something there. And then, of course, you have this serpent here, right? So there's definitely an association with these spirit gods and serpents, which are often used together when the gods of this world represent themselves through their various peoples. All right, so I think here that the information is somewhat inconclusive, but it can be harmonized, as I said earlier, if maybe Jesus is viewed as bringing a piece of wood to a tree and being nailed to the tree. And so I wanted to present that information to you all here. And also the understanding that we need to have with respect to some of the quotations that don't really have a source that we know about, but that probably existed when this was written. All right, 1038. I found this kind of interesting. It said it has, moreover, thou shalt not eat the hyena. He means thou shalt not be an adulterer, a corrupter, or like to them that are such. It's interesting. If this is the epistle of Barnabas, like the Apostolic Barnabas and his association with Peter and the Judaizing Jews and Galatians by Paul, I can see it a little, even though this is more refined, right? It's not really like full Judaizing necessarily, but there's definitely more of a law-like presentation, right? Even when in the Greek text it gets into the later chapters and talks about the light versus the darkness, right? The light is all basically these kind of law-like commands that are presented. And then he gets into this kind of discussion about the older laws, and there's some unusual articulation of ideas when it comes to the law that was originally given to the Hebrews after being freed from Egypt, and the consequences of them making a molten image and stuff. But anyway, he also talks about how the animal annually changes its sex and is at one time male and another time female. And I looked that up. I wasn't really familiar with that, and it just turns out that spotted hyenas do have what looked like male genitalia, just as part of their normal birthing process. So that makes that helped me understand better the context of what he was talking about here. And then in 14:204 through 2:10, for it is written how the Father, about to redeem us from darkness, commanded him to prepare a holy people for himself. The prophet therefore declares, I, the Lord God, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thy hand, and will strengthen thee. And I have given thee for a covenant to the people, for a light to the nations, to open the eyes of the blind, and to bring forth from fetters them that are bound, and those that sit in darkness out of the prison house. Yet perceive them when once we have been redeemed. And again the prophet says, behold, I have appointed thee as a light to the nations, that thou mightest be for salvation even to the ends of the earth, saith the Lord God that redeemeth me. And again the prophet saith, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the humble. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim deliverance to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to announce the acceptable year of the Lord, and the day of recompense, to comfort all that mourn. So this is a section here that, I just found very relevant in terms of Christian thinking. And he identifies the Lord who's speaking in all these texts, right? The Lord thy God, saith the Lord God. He's talking about the Father, right? Sometimes, as we know, the Lord is used, especially after the first entry and stuff, and we have the substitution of the divine name with the nomen sacra. But we already know Jesus is made Lord to the glory of God the Father, right? It's totally different from how the Father is already Lord to his own glory, not to someone else's glory. You have to contextualize Trinitarians. But very clearly, right, he's talking about the Father. He's not talking about a tripersonal God, Trinitarians. You're not talking about any multi-personal God, just like he wasn't when we read earlier in the Epistle of Barnabas about Genesis 1:26. How the God there, according to Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas, is talking to the Son. So it can't be the Trinity that's being referred to. And according to you, it's a plural majesty indicating more than one person that's talking. Or you don't really believe that the reference is what it says. Right? You get into all kinds of problems there. I talked about it in parts 1 and 2. Hebrew, plurals, and the Trinity. Chapter 19, 255 through 258. Thou shalt be subject to the Lord and to, notice that word there, Trinitarians and others who would question the use of other, even though most of your Bibles use other in other texts than Colossians 1, 15 through 17, where you're so sensitive, right? You get so bothered by other there, even though it specifically provides the exception that other is meant to indicate in verse 15, and then goes on to describe things where other, like being first in all things, would be clearly appropriate. Because Jesus isn't the first in every single thing, is he? Like we've talked about. He's not the first liar. He's not the first many things. It's context, Trinitarians. And so here we can see other translations using terms like other, because obviously if we're being subject to the Lord and to masters, that wouldn't exclude the Lord from being masters, right? See, in the original text, this would be the Greek text here because we're past chapter 17, they didn't use other, but the translator felt, right? You can see here kind of some of the thinking in the use of other, whether it's NWT or other translations using other, right? The translator thought that was a little odd right there and put this other in brackets. Yet you would think the New World Translation's like the only Bible that, or only translation of an ancient Greek text that's ever done that, right? Unbelievable. It's one thing if other doesn't fit in the context, right? That's legitimate criticism. But when it clearly fits, right, well, it's their theology that doesn't fit, right? That's why they go nuts. Anyway, I wanted to point that out. Thou shalt be subject to the Lord and to masters as the image of God, with modesty and fear. That's exactly what we teach and believe with respect to the way we accept Jesus as God, just like Thomas did, right after Jesus told them who our God and Father is, right? It's the same God and Father he has. But when we're dealing with Jesus, we're not dealing with anybody other than God. He's not doing his own will. He's not teaching his own teachings. He's not doing his own works. It's the Father. That couldn't be made more clear, probably more times than most other teachings in the Bible. Right here, it's basically saying the same thing. Be subject to the Lord as the image of God. Right? Is that idolatry right there? Well, it's not bad idolatry, right? This is the idol you get, right? Just like the serpent in the wilderness. This is the Messiah. This is the Son of God. This is the one that represents what God says is okay. If you acknowledge this one, because this one isn't doing anything but what I tell him to do. It's basically me. That's my image right there. You know, the imprint. Although that's character, right? This icon, you can still image, character. One represents the other. One is the image of the other. One was made after the image of the other. So when we recognize Jesus as God, just like Moses did when he recognized angels in the burning bush as God, right? Whether he knew it or not. We know according to Acts 7, they were angels, right? And we have multiple other accounts where this happens. Trinitarians just don't recognize the context of the Bible. And others, right? It's not just Trinitarians. People who fail to actually interpret the Bible with the Bible and with contemporaneous sources that are accurate as well. But instead, they go hundreds of years later, way outside the context, right? Everything's totally different. And they come up with all new terms and ideas to try to make sense of what is already sensibly explained in the Bible. By the Messiah himself, I would add, in John chapter 10, verses 30 through 36. To me, I don't know how you could get any clearer in terms of him explaining to you what is meant when the term theos is used of him. Either way, this is how it works, right? We subject ourselves to Jesus, just like the Israelites subjected themselves to the serpent on the pole that represented Jesus, because the serpent on the pole that represented Jesus represents the Son of God, who represents God. No one else, not even himself. That's why it's to the glory of God the Father. That's why people who have a problem with worshiping Jesus, the problem is they're not understanding the association between the two. Trinitarians, of course, we know they have a whole different metaphysic. Others who have a discomfort with it, they think if you say worship Jesus, they think you mean, sometimes some people think you mean something other than glorifying the Father. Okay, by worshiping Jesus, I mean glorifying the Father. Okay, by acknowledging Jesus as God, I mean he represents the Father to me. That's it. My Father, your Father. My God, your God. Everyone acknowledges Jesus. All knees bow, heaven and on earth and underneath the earth, to the glory of God the Father, the one who put him in that position, the one on whose throne he's sitting, right? Yeah, that's a big difference. And it's totally permissible. Why? He's representing the one God. He's basically showing the ultimate submission and worship. Because having all authority and power, he chooses not to do his own will. You try refusing to do your own will, having all authority and power, right? We probably won't have that opportunity. Just think about that for a moment in our sinful state, right? And not everyone's going to handle that the right way. He did. He handled it with no authority and power, and he handles it well with all authority and power, and that's why he has it. That's why the people that die faithful to him and after his pattern get it too. Revelation 2 through 3. All of this is consistent. Thou shalt not issue orders with bitterness to thy maidservant or thy manservant who trust in the same God, lest thou shouldest not reverence that God who is above them both. All right, kind of like what we were talking about in the Bible and slavery video. I'll have that split up soon, by the way. I'm almost done, Everett. I almost have all of the incorrect references. I misreferenced an individual in that video a few times. That's okay. I got it right a few times too. And I'll edit it out, and I'll eventually put up one clip just for the Bible and slavery part, and another one just for the Bible or the United States and slavery part. Either way, I think this is consistent with that, right? Christians are never, Jews and Christians were not to mistreat those who were considered slaves. And in the ancient world, of course, as I explained in that very video, it was a whole different situation and was basically the way of things up until several hundred years ago. But either way, in the ancient world, like a couple thousand years ago, several thousand years ago, if you weren't sold into slavery, in some cases, you died. Okay, and in the biblical sense, you were not to mistreat slaves. If you don't mistreat slaves, I think you were probably all right. You were allowed to eat holy things. You had more rights and privileges than settlers or foreigners, and they weren't slaves. Right, so there were privileges that are often not brought up when people try to misrepresent the Bible and read back into the Bible these later ideas and views, like I talked about in that video. All right, let's take a look at a couple last things. So I wrote these here as checks. Let's underline those real quickly to separate them off, right? This is another, so this one here from chapter 5, verses 46 through 47 says, For says he who prophesies regarding him, spare my soul from the sword, fasten my flesh with nails, for the assemblies of the wicked have risen up against me. Now, when I read that, I immediately realized that's not a part of any text of the Bible I've read. So, when I check the reference, right, chapter 5, one of the best ways to do is get the Ante-Nicene Fathers English series. It has more notes than the English translation of Loeb Classical Library. But in chapter 5, if we take a look at that area that's being referred to there, 46 and 47, it refers to Psalm 119. And in the footnote on page 140, after that part where it says, spare my soul from the sword, fasten my flesh with nails, for the assembly of the wicked have risen up against me. Fasten my flesh with nails, right? That doesn't sound like anything you've read in the Old Testament, right? That'd be pretty explicit. That would definitely be part of the Pre-Christian Evidence Jesus was the Biblical Messiah series, right? We get that in some other texts, like the one whom they pierced and dug out his hands, and text from the Psalms that I've talked about. Either way, here in the footnote, it says, these are inaccurate and confused quotations from Psalm 22:21 and 119:120. Right? So, and the part where it talks about fastening my flesh with nails, the part where I looked at these references, where in the footnote it says it looks like, it's confused, inaccurate, and blending together some text from the Psalms, I thought I need to see this, because if there's something in there that I haven't noticed that could be credibly considered pre-Christian evidence Jesus is the biblical Messiah, something fairly explicit that's uniquely fulfilled in him but foretold, a while earlier before he was born. The Psalm 119:21 reference. In that text, Psalm 119:21, here's what it says. That part where it says, fasten my flesh with nails. It says in the Psalm 119:120, I have reckoned, Psalm 118, 119. If you're looking at Brenton's translation, it would be on page 773. I'm going to read how he translates it, and then I'm going to share the Greek corresponding terms with Epistle of Barnabas. It says, so I've reckoned all the sinners of the earth as transgressors, therefore I have loved thy testimonies. Penetrate my flesh with fear, for I am afraid of thy judgments. Penetrate my flesh with fear. The Greek is kathelosan ek tu phobu, su tas sarkas mu. Now, when you compare that with the Greek text in Cursop Lake or the Codex Sinaiticus online I showed you earlier, but if you're looking at the Cursop Lake edition, it's the part I was marking earlier. If you look at chapter 5, if you look on pages 356 and 357, the part where it says, fasten my flesh with nails, right? It's like Barnabas is quoting a part of the Old Testament we're not aware of, right? But there's this reference in Psalm 119 that uses very similar terms, right? I just read you the Greek from Psalm 119 here. It says, spare my soul from the sword and nail my flesh, for the synagogues of the wicked have risen up against me. Nail my flesh. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Now, listen to those together. In Epistle of Barnabas, Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Psalm 119. Kathe losan ektophobu tu su tas sarkas mu. Now let me just read the parts that correspond. Kathe, the Septuagint, Psalm 119, verse 120. Kathe losan tas sarkas mu. Epistle Barnabas. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Read it one more time. Epistle Barnabas. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Psalm 119, 120. Kathe losan tas sarkas mu. Kathe losan tas sarkas mu. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Kathe losan tas sarkas mu. Right? It's you got the mu instead of being after kathe losan, you have it at the end after tas sarkas in Psalm 119. Otherwise, it's the exact same words. Now, penetrate my flesh. The difference, of course, is the extra words used in Psalm 119, right? Ek tu phobu su. Penetrate my flesh with your fear. The penetrate my flesh part, I've got to think about this because I'm doing the pre-Christian evidence Jesus is the biblical Messiah, right? And there's enough here, I think. I've got to look at it a little closer, but there's definitely enough here with the Epistle of Barnabas reference to Psalm 119, 120, and kathe losan and tas sarkas. Kathe losan mu tas sarkas. Kathe losan tas sarkas mu. Penetrate my flesh, right? That is a pretty, now that could refer to a couple things, right? It could refer to the nails or the spear. Remember, Jesus got stabbed in the side by the Roman officer. I think this is probably something I'm going to have to do a pre-Christian evidence Jesus is the biblical Messiah on. Not because of the letter of Barnabas. I mean, it's giving me the idea more refined than I had previously thought of. But because of Psalm 119, 120. And I'm going to have to incorporate that, I believe. Whether it's the same level of contextually credible penetration of flesh, similar to what Jesus experienced, right? There's two possibilities. Again, the penetration of the flesh with the nails or the spear in the side. To me, that's a pretty unique reference in Psalm 119 that I think we're going to have to look closer on. So I wanted to bring that up. Thank you, Henry. I appreciate that. It's very kind of you. I know you work hard like all of us, so I appreciate it. Let's look at our last reference. This is another one I wanted to check with you guys. And again, thus saith Isaiah, the Lord said to Christ, my Lord, whose right hand I have holden, that the nation should yield obedience before him, and I will break in pieces the strength of kings. Behold how David calleth him Lord and the Son of God. So we have a reference to David calling Jesus Lord and the Son of God, right? We already know Psalm 110:1. Lord, Jehovah said to my Lord, a clear distinction in the Old and New Testaments with the use of the divine name versus the actual term for Lord, which is consistent with how Jesus is depicted elsewhere in the New Testament and Old. Psalm 102 in the Greek version, where Jesus is presented as the Lord who stretched the heavens and made the earth in association with Jehovah as wisdom, like we talked about earlier. Why God said, let us make to him. Son sees what the Father does the same thing in like manner. But notice here it says, thus Isaiah said, the Lord, which would be Jehovah, said to Christ, my Lord, which would be Isaiah, similar to David, calling Jesus my Lord in a context where he's distinguished from the actual Lord who speaks in the Old Testament, Jehovah. Exact same thing that David does in Psalm 110:1. The epistle of Barnabas has Isaiah doing right here. Now, if we look at the reference, chapter 12, we'll end with this. It's not really the quotation that you're familiar with from Isaiah, right? Where something in Isaiah says, the Lord said to Christ, my Lord. So if you look at the references in the Hendrickson edition, or Ante-Nicene Fathers edition, it says, and again, thus saith Isaiah, this is page 145, the Lord said to Christ, my Lord, whose right hand I have holden, that the nation should yield obedience before him, and I shall break in pieces the strength of kings. Behold how David calleth him Lord and the Son of God. Exactly like we believe. The reference, though, where it says Isaiah said, or saith Isaiah, the Lord said to Christ my Lord. Footnote 18. Okay, so there's apparently a correction in Codex Sinaiticus where it makes Christ Cyrus. It says Codex Sinaiticus corrects to Cyrus, as in Septuagint. I wonder if we can see that. Let's go ahead and see if we can see that. It's going to be chapter 12, Codex Sinaiticus Online. I want the very last part. Or actually, it's a little bit above, huh? Okay, so that's 10. We want the part where it says, Isaiah said, the Lord said to Christ, my Lord. It's not marked. The verses aren't marked in the Hendrickson edition that I'm referring to. Might have went a little too far there. Where are we? Doesn't really show a break here. Text is a little faded. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to find that. Okay, I think we're getting close. Let's see if I hit this, will it bring up? I wanted to highlight there. Okay, good. Okay, so right here, let's see if we can I get that to show? I want to make that bigger. I want to try to make this bigger here. But I don't see the enlarging. Oh, maybe. Okay, that's better. This thing right here, you see this right here? It's not showing in its normal form. Right here on the left side, straight across from like my eyes. It's just showing that little white rectangle. There's usually like a meter that shows up and down so I can know how big to make it. It's not showing the whole thing. But I'm going to make it big. And I want to try to see if we can see in Codex Sinaiticus what it's talking about here when it says Codex Sinaiticus corrects what I read to you right here, right? The Lord said to Christ my Lord, right? Quoting Isaiah, right? That's not something that's in Isaiah. So what is the deal there? I think I am seeing now. Okay, here we are right here. And here it says, and again he says, therefore, Isaiah, the Lord to the Lord of me. So that's right here. I can just get this to move out of the way. There we go, right here. Now look, you see, so there is a corrective, there is a little correction here. I'm trying to get this to move over, but I think you can see it. See this right here where my cursor is circling? It's hard to make out, but it looks like it has the word there, kairos. I can't make it out completely. Either way, the note here says that Codex Sinaiticus corrects to Cyrus. And I believe that is in fact what it does right here. Right next to the part where it talks about the Lord, right? There's the word Lord with a little line over it. I don't know if you can see it. This is where it says, the Lord said to Christ, the Lord of me, is what basically the transcription over here seems to indicate. But then on the right side here of where this red box is, all the way over to the right, you see that stuff on the side right there? That is the correction that is made on the side from what most translations say. The Lord said to Christ my Lord. It's corrected to Cyrus. So the significance in terms of the connections made in the Epistle of Barnabas, maybe in the Epistle of Barnabas, Cyrus was simply seen as a greater Christ in a way that allowed for this application of this text, regardless of whether it was originally to be applied to Cyrus, right? Cyrus, my anointed one, my Messiah, basically, right? My chosen one. So there would be a prefiguring there that wouldn't be hard to establish at all. But I wanted to show that to you so you also get a sense of how these texts are done, right? This is Codex Sinaiticus, about 330 or so, early to middle 300s. And in it we have the Epistle of Barnabas, right? And here's the main text. And then you get a little correction here on the side, right? So this way you understand more of what's happening and how you can also verify things that we reviewed together so that you develop a good understanding of material, whether it's from the Bible or whether it's from early Christian or other writers that talk about the Bible, or that may in fact be people from the Bible, like Clement of Rome, like Barnabas. And while we don't have the same degree of confidence and historicity for texts like the Epistle of Barnabas that we do for books of the New Testament, for example, we nonetheless have enough credible information and evidence from manuscripts, earlier Christian writers that wrote after some of these individuals, but that were more aware of their circumstances and things that they did or didn't do, so that we can at least look at them in the context of early Christian writings, and then from them gain an understanding of early Christian views about Jesus.